Welcome to Conversations with Joy podcast.
Welcome to the very first podcast from our new organization, which is called Wellness, Wisdom, and Wholeness. Today is our first episode, and what I'd like to do is give you a little context around why I have chosen to start a platform around wholeness and wisdom and wellness. Because in the day that we're living with, the politics, the climate, the energy, good Lord, the tariffs, we're all pretty much feeling lost. We're feeling lost and alone and don't know what to believe. So as we go on in a series of conversations with you, the audience, I will be introducing various speakers, various experts, and also share some of my own learnings with you in the hopes that we can continue a dialogue to help one another move through these very challenging times. Not insurmountable for sure, but very challenging times. My first guest is a woman I've known for over 20 years. Her name is Melody Lebaron, and she's been giving speeches and talks and retreats for many, many years, focusing on grief work and how do we move toward wholeness. I myself have written several books on grief and really think, in addition to when you lose a loved one, thinking about grief in general and loss in general. So our first podcast is called Radical Forgiveness, which is a book that's written by Mr. Tippin and many years ago, and it's been very, very helpful to both Melody and myself. So we've coined Radical Forgiveness and Grief as a way to open the conversation and ask questions of one another. And also, if you wouldn't mind jotting down some of your questions that you'd like to contact us with, we'll give you a contact information at the end of the podcast. So let's welcome our first guest, Melody Lebaron, who will share her wisdom, talk about a little bit about her experience and why she's here today. Melody.
Thank you, Dr. Joy. It's wonderful to be here. We've held this vision for wellness, wholeness, and wisdom for a couple of years now. Yeah.
So, Melody, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from, a little bio on why you care so much about sharing with others your grief journey.
I grew up in a very rigid sort of expression of the Mormon church, so held those really strong beliefs, many of which were comforting. The pursuit of perfectionism, not so much. And along the way, I had experienced a good bit of loss. My mother died in my arms. My sisters were there. My dad was there when I was 35 years old. And we had with her a shared death experience. That term was identified about 15 years ago now. And it's similar to a near-death experience, except you're sharing the experience of the one who dies. So that gave me, that shared death experience with my mother gave me a higher perspective. There are many, many ways in which her death changed my day-to-day decisions and choices that I was making about the way I spent my time and my priorities.
Melody, so tell us a little bit about how your life experience with your family growing up really informs the work that you do today. Just what was your inspiration, if you wouldn't mind sharing that?
For example, I was raised with a service ethic. My parents worked hard, pulled themselves, both raised in poverty. We were very poor during my early growing up years, and it didn't matter. That did not make any difference to our well-being and to our decisions as a family and with my parents as individuals to be of service to others. And so I saw, this woman who had had 7 children, um, 12 pregnancies. She tried 12 to have 12 children. Well, my dad had this big career, which involved being gone most of the time. I saw them do what I later realized was sort of out of balance. So giving more outside the home, because then you so much praise from others, uh, giving less than was needed inside the home. And so the 600 people that came to mourn my mother were there with my family for a day. Then each of my mother's children went home to our own very complicated grief, because there were things that hadn't there were things that had happened in our growing up years and even beyond that amends were not made for, and that we were still carrying the burden of. So, which is how and why I needed to find my own way to radical forgiveness and to work. But that choice, that going through my mother's death and all of us caring for her, no matter the wounds that we individually were holding from her, caring for her as she left us, holding our own very complex grief, and then watching all of these people and hearing this high praise, knowing these people don't really know the whole picture of my very complicated mother, who was bipolar and was our abuser inside the home. So um, I made a vow to myself at my mother's service that I would always give more to my children than I was giving outside the home, that I would reprioritize and rebalance how I was spending my time, and that I would hold my children as my number one service priority while they were in here.
Boy, your introduction, Melody, is amazing. First of all, I can't fathom a parent having 12 pregnancies. I mean, wow. And also the fact that through your mom's struggles, you were witnessing the abuse. And I can really see how it really made an impression on you at a very early age. It's interesting when you think about loss and forgiving. My own childhood was very happy. I mean, there were 5 of us, and I actually found a lot of peace and love outside of my home, which caused me to adopt other parents. So I had my biological parents, and I was very gifted to adopt, like intuitively, 3 other families, which has always given me a worldview of abundance. The fact that if things aren't working at home, I can lean on the community. Like one of the sayings I love from Richard Bach's book, Illusions, is rarely do members of the same family grow up under the same roof. And I think our connection is so strong. You're a sister to me because of our shared experience of the loss of our sons. So, Melody, another experience that I share with you about radical forgiveness is when I was about 19, I met this wonderful woman in school, a classmate, and we just hit it off right away. Our birthdays were within 2 days of each other. And we even looked alike, even though she was Italian. It was summer, so we both were tanned. But let me just explain to you how this great love just grew out of being in class together, driving around in neighborhoods, looking to see, which guys were hanging out. Anyway, just really deep love. And it was expressed at one of our birthdays when we decided to share some celebrations together. I remember making her a cake. She loved chocolate cake at 5 in the morning and driving to her neck of the woods, which was in the beach, and like sunrise birthday celebration, and had a couple of gifts to share with her. And what she did was she made us both almost like identical dresses that were like Hawaiian type, beautiful colors. And I just said, wow, this is a great first friend in college, and I'm just going to know her forever. And then one day, she called and said, I am getting married, and I want to talk to you. So, and that was pretty much a short conversation. So I was so excited as I got into my car. I'm going to drive to her home, and I know she's going to ask me in person to be her maid of honor. Well, was I surprised? I get to her home, and rather than coming inside, she came outside. And I remember standing with her face to face. As I don't know what she said before, but I do know what she said that has stuck with me all these years. And she said, you cannot come to the wedding because my fiance doesn't like Black people. And I think that was my first and only out-of-body experience. Because remember all the joy and love I had for her, my friend, and we just had the same birthday, and we enjoyed the same things. And she just blurted out I couldn't come to her wedding when I was all ready to hear, would you be my maid of honor? So I actually visualized myself outside of my body watching the two of us as tears ran down both of our faces. I don't remember what happened after that, but I do know I got in my car, and as I was driving to my boyfriend's house, I said, I hate white people. I hate white people. Like, how can this be happening? And as I walk in the front door of my boyfriend's house, his mother, Caucasian, and their friends were sitting there. And as I walk in, she says, wow, this is joy. This is our joy. We love our joy. And in that quick moment, I went, I can't hate all white people. So then I went, got on the telephone, called her up, and said, I hope you have a great life. I understand that you wanted to be married so badly. I'm really hurt by this. But I'll get over it, and I just wish you the best. Years later, actually, I went on about my life, and years later, I think I ran into her, and she had these 3 children, and we kind of reconnected standing there in the supermarket, and I asked her about her life, and she said, well, you know that marriage didn't last. And I said, what do you mean? Well, it lasted about 7 years, but who he was someone who I couldn't be with. Now, I wasn't surprised about that because the Donna that I knew and loved wouldn't be cruel like that. It just speaks to the desperation that she had to, like, get married. Anyway, we reconnected. I met her new husband. We got on fine for years. And then as I was teaching classes some years later, I would tell the story about forgiveness, and I would tell the first part that you've heard already, and people in the room would gasp and say, oh, she's mean and that's horrible. And I said, well, wait a second. I had a part to play in this. Can you imagine if you love someone the way that I described, that you would actually give up and wish them well the same day your heart was broken? Would you really do that? Or would you fight for it? So I actually talked to her later and said, here's how I process what happened between the two of us. It took 2 of us, and what I could have done differently was to fight for you, to give it some time, to check in and see how your marriage was going, to just say that to just give up was something that I did that I regret to this day. And so there's always 2 sides of every story. And if we get stuck in the one side is, I'm right, you're wrong, there's no forgiveness available there. There's no space for forgiveness. And what I learned through processing years later, that I played a major part in us not having a relationship. And I'm happy to say today we're still talking 50 years later. I've watched her kids grow up. Her husband is amazing. And I like teaching this because I love to watch audiences jump to a conclusion that someone was wrong, as opposed to both of us had an opportunity to experience the situation and then choose what we would do differently. It's like what I often teach. Any situation or every situation can be viewed as a burden or an opportunity. I had chose burden at first, and then later on turned to opportunity. What can I do to shift this conversation, to shift this relationship so that everyone could heal and everyone could see their part in it, because it's never one person only. It's two people.
Yeah. But I have an example that I think can flow right in. Can I just go into that? So now when I work with clients, what how we frame what's happening to us helps us to make meaning in powerful ways. And so I use this illustration. I tell people this is the continuum of human emotion and experience. And we can see that, it goes up. Like we can have, there's a midline. Everything above the midline is comfortable, is happy. Everything below the midline is uncomfortable. Now, the ancient patriarchs, if you are Christian, you remember from the Old Testament, the ancient patriarchs began to judge or label experience as good or evil. But many of us find that it's actually more effective to treat all of this as just simply human emotion and experience, and to wonder, to hold the curiosity. I wonder if one of our jobs as human is simply meant to go up and down this continuum with and ease. Now, when we get too caught up in labeling, this is bad, this is evil, I don't want to, like Job, I don't want to look bad to my friends and have them criticize me. So I don't want to feel this. I don't want to talk about this. Well, many of us then begin turning off emotional experience, but you turn off these emotions without also shutting down these. So now one thing that, we have to talk about when we talk about human emotion and experience, that right down here, when something happens where we are so shocked that, like with your story of your friend, you are you're dissociated from the body, you're watching it happen, because we're right down here and we feel like a victim. This is the lowest that we can go in human experience. Well, when we feel like a victim, ideally, our job is to breathe deeply, hold a compassion for ourselves, because the moment we are holding compassion for ourselves as well as the other, it gives us a little bit of grace, a little bit of space. And when we can rise up from that bottom victim place, and there are some ways we can help ourselves do that. Any act, any act of creation, whether it's moving, driving, dancing, any deliberate choice that we make, creating a piece of art is going to move us up this continuum. And when we can, when we're holding a higher frequency, we very often see a different side to the story. Just like you realized eventually, wait a minute, I just called and said goodbye. I didn't fight for that friendship. And you may never, if you had kept yourself in the victim place of this friend betrayed me for a guy, you might never have realized, well, wait, I didn't fight for the friendship. So I have 5 kids, and Logan was my middle son, is my middle son. And he was born with a speech impediment. And so as a youngster, what came out was just kind of battling. So I literally prayed for the gift of tongues so that I understand my child. And we developed of something that I think was very akin or close to ESP. We could feel each other's hearts. And when Logan was 13, his older brother was living with his dad, And he really wanted to reconnect with Brandon, his older brother, my old, and he went to live with his dad, and it just wasn't good for him. He just couldn't do it. He came back, but by the time he was 15, he really felt an urgency to really reconnect with Brandon. So he tried again. He went back to live with his dad, and Brandon really shut him out. Brandon was, by this point, really shut down emotionally. And every day, Logan would try, and he would call me and he would say, "Mom, Brandon still won't let me into his heart." And so, we would talk. Now, when I talked to my other boys, as teenagers, it was talk about the weather and some talk about school, but they weren't really able to have, this conversation about feelings. But Logan was just very different. He was very emotionally and spiritually intelligent. So he had that bond. And um and I got a call one day from their dad that there had been an accident. And I don't think there's anything that can drop us down to the victim place more than our child dying. And what we didn't know, and we wouldn't find out for a year, and I only found out because of the paramedics chose to come and tell me, but Logan was dead when the paramedics arrived, and they revived him. And they rushed him to the hospital, and we all rushed to the hospital. And we could see that Logan was on life support. They weren't giving us much information. They were just telling us that Logan's injuries were critical. But I could see that he had broken his collarbone, and they had put a brace, and they had put a cast on his leg, which gave me hope, right? And so finally, when they let me in to see him, my son Brandon is there, my ex-husband is there, their dad, and it took my body a few minutes to adjust, to recalibrate to the reality of what had happened to my son's body. But as soon as I could get my breath, because I know from when my mother died, when my younger sister died, I know that hearing remains. I know that hearing is the last sense to go. And so I said out loud the words, "Logan, we are here to help you recover. We are here for as long as that takes, if that's what you and God want. And we are here to let you go, if that's what you and God." Now, that last part, Joy, that last part is not something I had put there. The words came out of my mouth, and my son, right across Logan's bed from me, looked at me in horror. "Mom, what did you say?" And I looked like I didn't put that there. I don't know what I said. But now looking back, I know that my soul was in touch with Logan's soul, and that was my soul's way of honoring Logan's soul's choice. And that night, it took a long time for me to get to sleep because I was just so much in prayer and worry about my child. And I don't know how long. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up with an awareness that someone was in the room with me. At first, of course, I thought it was my mother because she had many times come to visit me after her passing. And then I realized, no, that's not my mother. So I thought it was my sister who had passed. And I realized that's not what my sister feels like. So I just opened my awareness and I heard Logan's voice. And he said, Mom, I had a choice. I want to go. And, in that moment, against all of my own wishes, my heart surrendered to his choice. And he reached out and took my hand, and I left my body and had the most profound shared death experience I've ever had. And the next morning, when we got to the hospital, my ex-husband was there waiting at the nurse's station. I arrived, and the doctor arrived and said, I need to meet with you in my office. And we sat down, and she said, your son has no brain function. We need to take him off of life support. And she said, your son is an athlete. He is healthy. He has a strong heart. So we're going to take him off of life support this morning, and he could live for weeks or even months. And instantly I knew, no, he won't. He passed within minutes of removing the life support. And one of the things that my ex-husband had said, as I arrived at that nurse's station before the doctor arrived, he said, Melody, Logan wants to go. And I said, I know. We had both had whatever experience he had. I had had that really profound experience. We were both in alignment with Logan's choice when we stood on opposite sides of the bed and held sacred space for that choice as he left the body.
So, Melody, I'm wondering, and I think our viewers would wonder, is it different when someone dies quickly or when there's time to really be with your loved one before they actually transition?
Now, Joy, I don't want to give any of our listeners any misperception. Knowing that from my son did not mitigate my grief. I still had to grieve, but I grieved in a healthier way because I grieved with the knowing that my son had chosen this, that he had chosen this. Now, it wasn't until a few months in, maybe 6 months into my own grief process, one of the coaches and therapists I was working with said, Melody, you have a knowing that Logan's soul chose this for him. What if you held the wondering, the curiosity about whether or not your soul, before you took birth, might have chosen this experience for you? And that reframed so much for me. I was able to hold my grief, which I was still having to go through and process, much more expansively.
I think it's important for viewers to hear it's just not an easy road. And when you talked about, needing to forgive based on your relationship with your mom and then marrying the same mirror energy with your husband and then recognizing how can you forgive? I love when you're so passionate about how can you actually forgive harm done to your children. I experienced a similar thing. How does one do that? And so I want to hear more about how you did it, how you continue to do it. It really resonates with my own journey about how I was able to move through forgiving the father. My son's father is alive and attended my birthday party a couple years ago. So, like, full circle of anger and resentment on not being there for the boys. And then yet, forgiving. When you forgive, as you well know, you forgive others, you really find yourself forgiven, which is such a gift that people don't necessarily understand. When we do something, it's as if you think you're doing it for the other person. And the truth is, everything you do is for the self, and there isn't one.
I think there was forgiveness. It's interesting, this question about forgiveness, because as if it was choreographed, as if it was choreographed, 6 months before the accident that took my son's life, my 12-step sponsor called me after a meeting and said, "I know you've done a lot of forgiveness work about your children's father, Logan. I know you've done a lot of forgiveness work. I've witnessed some of it, but I need to call you out. You have more to do. I know that now you are seeing your teenage boys at the effect of some of the behavior that harmed you, and I know that it's apparent to you, and honey, you have to forgive that." And, she called me out on this, and I was like, how do you forgive damage done to your children? How does a mother forgive in real time damage being done to her children? And, this is emotional damage, some of which the boys were aware of at the time, and some of it they have only become aware of as adults. And she worked with me. I worked the steps. This was before my friend Colin Tipping's book, Radical Forgiveness. I didn't have the tools yet, but I worked it. And finally, about a month before the accident, my sponsor said, "Congratulations. You have done the work giving in real time as it is done to your children. Good for you." Happened, and then the accident happened. And there was something. Oh, I'm going to go back. About the same time she called me on my lack of forgiveness, I had a dream. And in the dream, it was a really vivid dream. Now, Logan's dad had done a lot of physical, mental, and emotional damage to me, which is why I was in the program, which was why I was in therapy, which is why I had been on the path of recovery. And I am grateful to him for that. He put that path of, my mother put me on that path of recovery. Then I married someone who had her same emotional profile. And I'm grateful for all that. And in this dream, it was a very vivid dream, and there were just 3 of us in the dream. This dream took place in a hospital room. Logan was in a hospital bed, and I was on Logan's right side, and my ex-husband, Logan's dad, was on his left side. And we were face to face, and in the dream, I knew that Logan was okay. In the dream, I had no worry, no concern for my beautiful son. So in the dream, I know that Logan is absolutely fine. I know he's going to be okay. Dream, all of my attention is on my relationship with this man with whom I had these first 4 children of mine. And in the dream, there was nothing but love between me and this man who had done so much harm. And the shock of that woke me up. And it was only a day or 2 after that dream that my sponsor said, "Melody, you've got some work to do around this relationship. You are still feeling like a victim because of the damage he's now doing. I'm in another state. I'm in another marriage, but he's doing damage to my children." And all this emotion about that. So there was the dream. Then she called me out. And then I spent all these months doing the forgiveness work. At Logan's death, that scene played itself out. As we released our son from this world, there was nothing but love between us, at least on my side.
So, it's interesting when you speak about like there's probably people when they hear us, they're going to be thinking, well, is it easy? I'm in my 20s and I have a terrible loss. So it's important to know that the old way of the stages, which I'm going to ask you a little bit more about, the traditional way of thinking about loss, there's not one way that fits everyone. There just is not one way. I know that the average I was told was two years, and in my own experience, it was practically 2 years. Maybe because I heard it was 2 years. I don't know, but you start wanting to, first of all, not wanting to have fun, not wanting to wear jewelry. I remember they were my experiences, and then slowly but surely, I was able to find the joy again, find it, and know because other people were counting on me. My other son, my grandchildren, people were counting on me. But we cannot short circuit the grief process that we're all need to do in order to be able to build capacity to love and share and teach others.
Yeah. Well, yes. I think, Joy, the reason that when my heart met your heart, I think we recognized something of ourselves in the other because both of us had been through the loss of a child in a similar way. Okay, I've shared the way that Spirit instructed me to hold my son's death as, as our soul's choices. But I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. The loss of a child, a divorce, a loss of a job, anything that we're not at choice about is going to knock us all the way down to the bottom of this continuum. And that is sacred ground. That holy. I am begging everyone who's going through a loss to treat the natural, normal, physical, emotional process of grief as if it is sacred. I realized something helped me realize that I needed to create sacred space in my life for the grief. So I turned my car into a sonic sanctuary. I had a cassette tape of songs that allowed my tears to flow. I attended 2 yoga classes a week. I would sit in the back of class. The moment we started, I would go into my emotions, the tears would flow. I would get up at the end of class and run out the door because I didn't want to answer any questions about why I was weeping through the class. Those were my appointments with myself to process. I kept a journal. There are ways in which I recognized that yes, I had other 4 other children. I had other work that I was doing, but my grief work was the most important work I did for the first 3 years after Logan died. Yeah. And something helped me with that to find that wisdom. I found mentors like you. I mean, I found people in my life who could hold sacred space for my grief. Yeah. One of the things I want to share about the grief process is there used to be a misperception in the field of those of us who work with grief that it was kind of a linear process and that you went from shock to anger, to bargaining, to no. Those were some of the steps of grief or the stages of grief identified by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 80s, who, she was working with the dying. Those are stages that the dying people go through. But when we have any kind of a loss, including the losses that we're experiencing in our country right now, the loss of civility, the polarization, the challenges, um, what we need to recognize is that these waves of grief can wash over us at any moment. So we can go from a feeling of shock and numbness, which is especially in the first few months after a loss, or we can experience a wave of anger, like this heat, and the next minute a wave of sadness, of being more easily irritated. All of the emotions that we associate with being below the midline of human experience are included in the grief cycle, not just five, and they don't happen sequentially. They're like these. But here's what I learned in that year after Logan died. I read this book, Yoga and the Quest for the True Self by Stephen Cope. And he spoke about, in the book, he talks about these actual waves of painful emotion do not last any longer than 60 to 90 seconds, 3 minutes at most. And as I'm reading this, I realize, oh, this is like birth contractions. They're like the contractions I experienced during the birth process. And so these waves of grief, of emotion, whatever, whether it's anger or sadness or frustration, whatever the wave is, it's not going to last longer than my contractions. So Stephen Cope talked about the ability to breathe through the contraction. And then he says something just so brilliant that was so helpful to me. He says, if your grief, the intensity of the grief lasts longer than 3 minutes, that's how you know that your ego has gotten involved and is telling you an unhelpful story about what happened. And yes, the blaming, the shaming, the projection. And he said, all of that has to get separated out. He says the ego is like a puppy. It wants to jump up and contribute. And you are the one that has to tell the ego, no, sit, be quiet.
So, when you talk about the waves, Melody, it reminds me of a picture that I had about grief, and the word was tsunami. It's like a tsunami. And you were talking about the 3 minutes, and et cetera, and how the ego jumps in. Well, I remember the picture of a tsunami. So you get the wave, it comes, and like a tsunami, you get tossed to the bottom of the sea, and on the way down, there's like debris all in the ocean, et cetera, and you get bruised. But eventually you rise back above the surface and you're like floating and the sun comes out, like your life continues to go on. And then maybe a week, a month, a year, it could be 10 years later, the tsunami comes again. Whenever you're vulnerable and open to experience your grief, it's not on a linear path. Like you said, it just happens when it happens. And I think submitting and going with it is a way to minimize the battering and the bruising underneath the sea and just go with it, like let go and know that you will rise again and see the sun, even if it's for a short while. And that's what we talk about. We talk about the grieving process. It's different for everyone.
Right. There's a big piece here about surrender. And one story where you're just fully in the contraction, breathing through it, and then you come up to the surface, right? And that's what it's like with the waves of grief. So when you come up from a wave of grief, it could be that 10 minutes later, we're in the company of someone and we're laughing. And The goal is not to stay down at the bottom and be in this 10-year or 2-year grief process. The goal is to be able to go up and down the continuum in and be fully in present in the moment. So we have been taught with a lot of judgment and cultural overculture, judgment of grief. We have been taught that grief is a private, linear experience, and none of that's true. It's n- it must you grief, big grief cannot be processed privately. It must be held. So you must find a mentor, you must find a friend, you must find other people who can hold your losses with, and it's not with you.
Okay, so, we often liken grief to childbirth, and we tend to think it's going to go on and on and on, but it does have spaces in between it. I remember giving birth to my first son, and the doctor had said, okay, look, stay home until you have contractions every 5 minutes for an hour. And I went, oh, I can do that. So a couple weeks later, when I found myself in that mode of counting the number of contractions within that hour, it went like this: 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes. I did it for an hour, and I called the doctor, and he said, "Oh my goodness, no, you aren't hearing me correctly. You need to get to the hospital," which was 45 minutes away. So we grab our go bag, we get in the car, we start driving, and I remember my my toes. I mean, reliving it. My toes begin to curl. We get into the hospital, and I'm signing my name. I'm in a wheelchair, and I'm going, first name, middle name, last name, and I'm going. And then I get into um, the labor room, and the nurse says, "Wow, we don't have time to do any of the prep that we usually do for pregnant ladies." And I say, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, we see his head is the size of a quarter." And I said, "What do you need to see to get me into the delivery room?" She said, "The size of a silver dollar." I went, "Hold on." And she said, "Oh my God, your baby's coming." Right there, boom. I delivered Tommy within 20 minutes of entering the hospital. But what I also know that in that time frame, when I was having the contractions, like, we talk about grief, the other part of my body was fine. So the contraction would happen, and I go, party. Just remembering I had all this other real estate going on here that was not feeling the pain contraction. And I was able to mind over matter, let them come, at the same time know that there was going to be a rest. That's a lot like what we describe when we talk about the tsunamis, coming and going and moving with it. We know women have 20-hour births, contractions, 24 hours, 2 days. I'm just curious about if we would submit in life to grief and submit to childbirth and submit to a loss of a job or submit whenever and just let it go and see it flow.
So one of the things I want to also mention is that, like I said, we cannot grieve our big losses alone. We need community. One of my teachers, my mentor, Francis Weller, wrote the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, in which he talks about the 5 gates of grief that happen. You and I have already entered through the first gate, which is losing someone or something we love. There are other gates of grief, and these these he calls them gate, these portals through which we take up what he calls the apprenticeship of sorrow. And you don't take this up alone. We the apprenticeship of sorrow with others. For me, when Logan died in 97, I discovered the group, the Compassionate Friends. Yeah. And there have been many other groups. I facilitate grief retreats several times a year where people come together with their losses, and we create sacred space for the grieving process so that we have a day long or a weekend long experience of metabolizing grief and our loss so that we can be more fully present. And one of the things that you will notice is that people who have metabolized their grief in community, people who have been able to speak about their shame and their vulnerability, like you see in 12-step rooms, like you see in people who come together and really allow themselves to be vulnerable and soft with each other. What you find is more integrated, whole, and complete people. You find people whose brains are recalibrated, rewired for more compassion and more service to others. That they have given themselves permission to go through the process of surrendering to the grief process, which matures us. It matures us.
So, when you're speaking about doing this grief process, we have found, and I think others will find, that it's not something you want to hide away and isolate yourself with. It's like some secret or something, or you're going to make someone feel bad, or you're going to get your feelings again. Like you said, we recommend support groups, whether it's compassionate friends, your family, if people who can handle it. Everyone cannot handle it. Begin to be conscious of when you can speak, and you can ask permission. Can I talk a little bit about my son? Can I talk about Dion? Is there a space for that? And to really have the notion that they're with you, not physically, but your loved one is with you always, because they live where? In your heart.
Yes.
So you spoke a lot about that. Where do we get our help? Where do we look? What do we read? What do we listen to? Making a safe space in your car. Making a safe space. Mine was the bathtub with candles. You think about what brings you joy. Think about what you're lost, the person you've lost, or is no longer with you, what they would want for you. And I think they would want you to move on and do your soul's journey. We need community. Sometimes people self-isolate. They don't want to tell anybody how they're feeling. They don't want any help. They want to be independent. And what I like to say about this whole grief process and support group is we want people to move to interdependency. Like, I can do it myself and I can't do it alone, is the theory I have about most things. Interdependency. So if you don't have a group yet, find a community or start a community, but choose to do this with others. It's like I used to say, if you have a happy moment and you share it, it's doubled. If you have a sad moment and you share it, it's divided. It doesn't lessen your grief. It's just that others can hear you, you can be heard, and it does support the process in a good way.
Yeah.
Listen, I want to thank everyone who tuned into our very first episode. We'll be looking for you in future episodes around radical forgiveness and grief and other interesting topics. So please find more information about this particular podcast on my personal professional website called carverassociates.com, where you'll find a very professional view of the world and how we train folks on emotional intelligence and other topics that are really similar to what we've just discussed today. So please don't be a stranger, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Thank you.